Hey everyone, this is just going to be a final video about the build of this guitar where for my own record, because you tend to forget your mistakes given enough time, so for next time I wanted to make my own record, but I thought particularly for people who might be embarking on their first build, which this was for me, some of the things that I picked up along the way may either work out to be good sort of, I guess, warnings, lessons, things to think about, and things that I sort of picked up as I went along. So, as with the entire video series that I did, none of this should be treated as anything like gospel. It's having finished this now, I'm slightly less blind leading the blind, but as you'll see in the next little while, there's plenty of mistakes in this guitar, which kind of give it, actually, to me, give it its own little character. I think I certainly, the one thing I would say, and I imagine other people have sort of found the same thing, is I don't resent errors on this guitar like I have on guitars that I've bought. It's quite a different thing. So what I'll just sort of walk through is I've made a list of things and just some sort of comments about each of them, and things where didn't necessarily go wrong but could have very, very easily gone wrong. So we'll take a look at some of those. So first one I wanted to mention to you actually was the setup on the headstock here. As you know, when you get these, it's not in this shape at all, so you can make the sort of standard telly shape as I did here, or you could do something on your own. The thing I just wanted to mention to really take care of when you're doing this is, if you're using a jigsaw as I did, they're precise to an extent. I didn't have an awful lot of experience with jigsaws. I stayed outside the lines only just on a couple of occasions, and I could have really easily put this off square and actually sort of driven the blade in at an angle. I mean, things that you wouldn't do if you had experience with it, or a bit of practice, or at least knowledge that these things can happen. So to be honest, I think next time I would probably just use a coping saw, or a hand coping saw. It just goes a lot more slowly. It's not like it's going to take you a long time to cut the headstock anyway. So yeah, my preference next time around will definitely, I think, be for a coping saw. I mean, if I think I'm going to do a lot of this, I might invest in a bandsaw, but even then, with the shape of the neck, actually sort of controlling it square on a bandsaw is not going to be overly easy. So I think just the coping saw will probably be my preferred option. Okay, so on to some of the paint. Now, I didn't sort of get into this in a lot of the photos because you want it to look good, and I don't know if that'll even show up on the camera there, but you can see sort of just where my thumb is, and I'll just try and get that to refocus. You can see a little blotch there. Now, what happened there was actually a little bit of a pit in the wood, and what I did, this was after the top coat was on, and I thought, okay, well, I can just apply a small amount and it'll probably match in, which, as you can see, wasn't the case. So it's a little blemish there. Something else to note, you can see those little nicks there, and there's another one just in under the neck here, tiny one there, and another one just on the bottom there. Now, all of those ones where I nicked the paint, basically the same circumstances every time. The ones up on here, I'm not surprised about at all. It's like the sort of these corners of the wood where I just sort of bumped the sandpaper across it, and that was all it took. This one down here was a little bit different, and just a little lesson I learned about wet dry paper is it's really nice and gentle, high grit, so you're not taking loads off. What it can do, if you're not careful, as apparently I wasn't careful enough, is it can kind of, and this isn't wet, but what sort of happens is when it's wet, it can kind of catch as and I was trying to be really gentle working on the top, but I didn't notice it was kind of catching each time because I wasn't using a block or anything. I was just trying to do it really gently by hand, and it kept catching and catching and catching, and over enough goes, it actually rubbed that little bit away. So just something to be aware of there. The paint, this is nitrocellulose paint, so certainly not the toughest paint out there. If you're using like auto enamel or something like that, you're probably not going to have this problem. You might. I'm not a paint expert, but I know that there's plenty tougher than this. So just the paint goes in an instant. So particularly around the corners and stuff here, just be aware of that. One other thing I just sort of noted actually when we were talking there, you can see that the neck in that little pocket there, I am pretty confident that's a routing issue, and by the time I got to this stage, I cleaned everything out and gave it a sort of a good scratch with various tools to make sure that it was actually nothing stuck in there, which there wasn't. So I think that's actually more just a sort of a join issue with the routing shape. It hasn't affected performance at all, so it's not ideal, but I'm not, for my first build, I don't really care either by that same token. So yeah, so that was just another one on the list to be getting into. Now the ferrule placement. Now these aren't part of the kit, so these are something you can either choose to do or not. And now a lot of you will actually seen the close-up. You can see some of the pitting in the paint, which I'm going to come back to because there's what I found to be a lesson there. You can see with the ferrules there, I'm really, really happy with them, but they're not perfect. And that's something that I learnt a lot about for next time. It's a really sort of tricky thing because you can either drill through from the other side, which a lot of people will say, well, you don't want to do that because there'll be sort of tear out on the wood, but to mine, it doesn't really tear out's not going to be an issue at all because essentially the ferrules are going to require a wider drill bit anyway, so it becomes a bit of a moot point. But the reason I couldn't actually do it that way was severalfold. The main one being is that to drill through from the other side, from the bridge, is it would have required me to be sure that I was going to get an absolutely square drilling. Now, I don't have a drill press, so my method of drilling was certainly not the approved one for keeping things all square, but it worked out okay in this case. The consequence of that is that I essentially had to I drilled 2 holes through on the far left and far right of the bridge, and then essentially tried to measure it from there. Not a bad job, and I actually, that one there, second from the right, I don't know how it got off square like that, but it did, and it's okay. I'm happy with that. I'm happier having the ferrules than I am having it just strung from the top of the bridge. So it's okay. But I'll talk a little bit about how I measured that in a moment. But they were tricky, but for mine they were well and truly worth it. Now decals that I did, I've got one on the front here, and there's another very small one which will be, you can see on the back there. So the one on the back is great, which is excellent. The one on the front, there's a little bit of pitting there, and I think what happened there, I don't know if you can kind of see it there, just so you get the light at the right angle. It's difficult to sort of see actually when you look straight at it, but I think what I did, this was actually my second attempt at the decal, and I really wasn't, even when I watch videos on YouTube of people doing it, I wasn't that wild about how it looks. It's essentially a matter of if you've got to lay down many coats of paint or sealer on top of it and then sand them back gradually. It worked out, as you saw on the back one, fine. This one here, I actually went then with the black with the clear, and that worked great. The only problem with the black, I think, is the amount of, and I did this on a laser printer, the amount of black actually, I think, sort of bound up a little bit with when the sealer went on top. It was fine when we put it down. This is just a water decal type you'd use with little models and so forth. So it worked fine. Next time what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to get the logo 3D printed just like this, and then I'm going to actually just use like a Forstner bit to just drill a little flat hole in there and just lay it in, and then put like epoxy over the top of it to seal it, because it's just, the decals are fine, and I've seen people do way better job of this than I did, but yeah, for mine, I'm just going to actually put a something solid in there, which I think will work out quite a bit better. Next thing, the nut, when I put that in, this is a bone nut actually, but it's the same size as the one that came with it, but it just sat too proud, and I got myself some files from eBay just to cut the grooves a bit deeper, but then it was, by my reckoning, about 1 mil too high, and I didn't actually want to just cut an extra mil into each of these little notches here and leave it sitting sort of really proud. What I did was actually just sanded that back square and just basically cut 1 mil off the whole thing. So it's now sitting pretty neat, which I'm happy with. The bridge itself, this isn't the one that came with the kit. This is another one. I just kind of like this brass and this sort of fashion brass and stainless setup. The only thing that I found, which actually I didn't find, my teacher was the one who found this for me, but it's like, essentially the only thing I had to change was that the two in the middle were sitting a bit low in terms of string height. So for these, actually, I just raised these two little grub screws that you can see here, and then just push the saddles back a little bit. You kind of have to work in twos on this, which is fine. But that was the only adjustment I really had to make. So that was how I sort of treated the nut, which again worked out pretty fine, I think. The really only other things. And this sort of brings me to one of the bigger issues, is there's like there was a big sort of notch out there, just sort of on one of the corners of where the strap button is there. Something that, in terms of, I guess, lessons for next time, sort of things that I learned, mistakes that you make, I realised, are much better when you're going to get advice from people and ask for advice, and you can do with that what you will. But the thing I learned is that I reckon it's better to make a mistake yourself because of your own decision, rather than actually following someone's advice that doesn't sound right, and then that becomes a mistake. One of the things that I found is a big source of contention on a lot of forums and discussions is the use of grain filler with guitars, particularly under nitrocellulose. People seem to think that it causes problems. Now, I'm not saying that it's never going to, and look, as I say, this is entirely my experience, and there could be something really fundamental that I'm missing here, which, quite likely the case. There's a big fill in here of, which I think I talked about in one of the earlier videos, of grain filler, just the sort of standard stuff that you'll get from Bunnings, whatever hardware store you're looking at. I've had some experience with it in the past, and the thing that I think where people have problems with it is that you put a big chunk of it in and then essentially paint over the top of it. If it's not dry, if it hasn't cured, then you're going to have problems regardless of which paint is over the top of it. So if you're using big parts, you're going to have to do a little bit at a time and let it go off and let it go off and let it go off, and then you're fine at the end there. I haven't seen anything happen here. Maybe tomorrow the paint's going to peel off, and I'll know I was completely wrong. And if that happens, then it's a lesson for the future. The thing that you saw on the back, and there's also some on the front here, is there's sort of visible grain through quite a bit of the paint. I got a little bit nervous about using grain filler, and actually I used and in one of the videos I used a slightly diluted version. Now there's two things that happened there. This ash wood has really, really deep grain, and it's deep such that you can kind of sand it, but what it'll do is it'll get rid of like some of the grain, but then it'll just expose new grain in there, and so it's kind of difficult to sand out, I found. You can try sanding sealer, which wasn't really enough for this, so I used the sort of the light amount of the filler. Two things sort of happened there with this wood, I think, is that first of all, it probably shouldn't have been like even a slightly watered down version. Reason being is that once the sort of water comes out of it, it just actually gets drawn into the grain, and you get left with the same problem again. The other thing, though, in both cases, whichever way you go, is that when you've got sanding the filler on there, just sand it really gently. I realise I've sort of sanded it enough, like way back enough, that it's actually sort of exposed the grain a bit. It's better than it would have been without it. In retrospect, I would have used undiluted filler. If it's really grainy, deep wood like this, I would have used undiluted filler, really driven it in there, given it a good several days to go off, and then sand it really, really gently. I think in retrospect, you wouldn't want to leave the filler proud, but you'd want it not below the surface at all. So it's got to basically be there to make sure that it catches all of these grains. So I don't mind my first build. I'm all good with it. To me, it's just, I'm calling it character. You can call it whatever you like. But that type of thing is just sort of, I am annoyed. I would have rather just gone, kept my own counsel on that. But look, at the end of the day, as I say, I don't mind how it looks, but it's sort of, I think, a thought about errors that you make. It's better to make your own. I feel. So just a couple of other things I wanted to mention, and then that will really wrap it up. A couple of tools that I would really suggest you get hold of for your guitar build that aren't necessarily mentioned. First one is a pair of vernier calipers. These are really cheap. I think these were about $15, something like that, $20. These are the digital ones, so you don't really need the whole multiple scale thing to properly read vernier calipers, but that's okay. The good thing with these, when you want to do something like measure the width of ferrules for drilling, when you want to, like as I was sanding down the nut, I only want to take a mil off this, and being able to sort of grab it with a pair of calipers as I'm sanding, because you can't really tell. You can do it with a ruler, of course, but this just gives you really, really precise depth. When you're looking at anything you want to measure the depth of, there's the stick out on the back, so you can measure depth. They're just for very little money. I found them to be an excellent bit of kit. The other thing I would recommend buying is one of these. You may have one at home anyway. This is a center punch, and all a center punch does is, for when you're about to drill, you basically take this. It's got a nice fine point on it, which hopefully will focus. Put it on where you've got a drill, and then just with a hammer, just give it a tap, and it'll just put a hole in there. Then when you put the drill down, it will purchase straight away into the hole that's been knocked in there, and it's not going to move anywhere. Especially once you've got paint on, my mistakes with paint aside, you don't want to have a issue where you've got the drill bit wandering. It's going to get really upsetting very, very quickly for you. The last bit to say is actually about screwdrivers, which everyone knows what they are. You'll use them plenty on your project, and what I would say about them is just make sure you're not trying to use the same one for every screw. I had one instance where I was using a screwdriver that was much too small. for the screw. It slipped out and either hit me or hit the table or something like that. Didn't damage the guitar, thank goodness, but it was a very, very near miss and could have gone pear-shaped. So use the most suitable sized screwdriver that you possibly can. And it says it actually in the guide that comes with this. Can't recommend it enough. I bought this. This is when I've done some furniture adjustments on the backside. Each of these sort of pits is basically where I've had it sort of sat in the sun a bit, soften it up, and then just dragged the screw that I was putting in or whatever, just to give it a little bit more, or just to basically make it easier to drive in. Not necessarily something you're going to have to do every time, but I think, as most of you will probably find, even with a kit guitar, which is a lot faster than going from scratch, there's a lot of time that goes into this. So every sort of thing that you can do to make it a little bit easier, I think is important, or at least I think it's worthwhile. The only other couple of things I just wanted to mention, I don't, as I mentioned earlier, have a drill press. The way in which and it worked, I think, pretty well. This is going to sound just completely rough, but what I was doing to actually try and keep the drill square was I was just taking a sanding block, and once I'd used the punch to basically knock the hole, I would then put the drill bit in, check that it was square at this angle and try and hold it still, and then just put it square at that angle, and if it was good, then that was about as good as it was going to get, and I'd sort of just try and keep that on one side at least to make sure it was the drill was working okay. So that seemed to work okay. Very, very rough solution, and I mean, feel free to shake your head and say that that's wrong. I'm well aware it's not the ideal. There are in between, you can get little presses for drills. I did actually try one for a Dremel, which wasn't long enough to actually get it most of this, so it was kind of pointless, but that's okay. The only other thing that I have on my list to mention also soldering, which is actually sort of, I've had a little bit of experience with it, so the only thing I can sort of say that helped me more than just about anything when whoever told me it is that solder follows the heat. So obviously I'm not saying heat your components to the extent where they're going to get damaged, but you're not exactly using the soldering iron to, melt the solder and then sort of dab it against where it's got to go. The heating of the components and the wires, essentially such that they're hot enough to melt the solder, will see everything just sort of flow nicely. So yeah, decent soldering iron. This stuff actually, if you're looking to, I found this way better than the sponge that usually comes with with soldering irons, I should say. Cools the soldering iron tip down a lot less, and just lets you sort of clean the tip of the soldering iron off much more readily. The other thing, as I mentioned in the earlier videos repeatedly, was keeping the shop vac nearby. And it's the towel this is sitting on has got quite a bit of sawdust on it, so it's not a fine example, but yeah, having the shop a vacuum available was so good. One other thing actually, which wasn't on my list, which I just wanted to show you, use this carefully because they sort of leave a little bit of a film. This is a tack cloth. For those of you who haven't seen, they're only a few bucks at the hardware store. It's a slightly oily feeling cloth that you can just keep in a jar. What it does is, between coats, when you've got a sand or even just to get rid of dust, it just allows you to very gently take the dust and any other sort of grime that may be stuck to the paint surface. The painting is just such a big part of this that it's worth taking every bit of care. As I say, they do have a slightly oily film to them, so just use it carefully. You don't want to have greasy spots on anything or anything like that. So, but look, other than that, I have just been amazed with the sort of quality of the kit. In terms of the sound and playability, is quite amazing. It's I don't want to sort of over sell it, and I mean you'll all have your own experiences with this type of things, but yeah, it kind of makes me question the cost of high-end pickups. Let's put it that way. I've just been amazed with considering the cost of this entire kit, how good the pickups on this guitar sound. Now, I'm not saying that they're clearly for the price not going to be 100% copper hand wound pickups. These are not that at all. Um, the reason why I changed the components I changed on this are the bridge is not the one that came with the kit. The tuning tuners are not the ones that came with the kit. And the only other thing is the little strap buttons, which I got these because they're just a little bit more vintage looking, but there was nothing really wrong with the ones that came with it. I just wanted something a little bit rougher. But yeah, the sound of it is great. Not saying that if you bought a custom shop telly from Fender, I'm sure there will be many sound advantages and etc. For the price, the sound that this makes is amazing. So as I was saying, the reason I didn't actually change the pickups was because I wanted to have an example of the sort of cheaper end pickups and see how they go. So yeah, it's been great from that perspective. There's a video on the playlist of the guitar in action, so do check that out. But yeah, look, other than that, I hope that has been of some value to people who are just starting out on making their own kit. My fullest intention at this stage is to actually make my next one from scratch. So I'm actually just waiting for a piece of timber that I'm after. I'm really keen on getting a piece of Queensland maple for the body, and doing sort of essentially a Music Man style guitar, or probably another actually similar to a telly body with a Music Man style neck and headstock. But we will see how that goes, and I will be sure to post videos for anyone who is of interest of my experiences going through that. So yeah, as I say, nothing here that you can't find elsewhere, but I thought for the purposes of someone who's in the position of just starting out, I thought I would give you some of the findings that I'd had as I went through. So I hope that has been of some value, and all the best with your own builds.